Good afternoon. This is Beth Overmo, Strategic Plan Coordinator for the State Bar of South Dakota. I just want to welcome you for attending this webinar on FEMA appeals. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, this presentation will last between 45 minutes to 1 hour. All attendees are on mute mode, so there is a question tabs on the attendee control panel in case you'd like to ask a question of our presenter. With that, I will turn it over to Nathan Shequin, President of the Young Lawyers section, to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. This is Nathan Shequin, President of the Young Lawyers section of the State Bar. This program is being presented in large part due to the flooding and winter storms that occurred here in South Dakota in March and April of this year. In June, the President declared a disaster, and FEMA announced that federal disaster assistance would be made available to individuals in certain counties within the state. That triggered a memorandum of understanding between the American Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division and their Disaster Legal Services group and our Young Lawyer section of the South Dakota State Bar to establish a hotline for those seeking individual assistance to call and request for disaster legal services. We have had a hotline established to respond to those requests for disaster legal assistance, and Lisa Gavin is going to share with us FEMA appeals issues as she has been dealing with them in Iowa. Lisa graduated from the University of Iowa College of Law and Creighton University. She has been a staff attorney with Iowa Legal Aid since 1995 and has been working under a variety of different grants there. In 2015, in January, she became the project manager of Midwest Legal Disaster Coordination Project for Iowa Legal Aid. Everyone welcome, and thank you, Lisa Gavin.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. I have been involved in disaster response for Iowa Legal Aid since we had major disaster in the summer of 2008. But specifically this year, I have been working in conjunction with the Iowa State Bar and the ABA Young Lawyers in Iowa on our hotline due to the flooding we had on the Missouri River in western Iowa and also the Mississippi River in eastern Iowa. So for us, it's been a pretty active summer, as I know it has been in South Dakota. So what I wanted to talk today about was FEMA issues and a little basic understanding of FEMA and some problems that come up for households and then the appeal process with FEMA. And then if we have time, I will highlight some of the other disaster legal issues that can occur after a disaster. Some of those are state specific, so I won't be able, as an Iowa attorney, to advise you on South Dakota law, but I will at least bring up some of the issues that can also occur. So starting with FEMA, and this has been an issue in Iowa because we currently have 87 of our 99 counties under some form of a disaster declaration. Some are state declarations and some are federal individual assistance declarations. And so what I've had to make clear in Iowa, and this may be the case in South Dakota too, is that FEMA is only going to be available in a county or area that has been declared a presidential federal disaster and has individual assistance. And they generally call those FEMA IA counties, and the IA is for individual assistance. So not everywhere that's affected by a disaster will the residents of that county be eligible for FEMA. Next slide, please. Here are the counties and reservations in South Dakota that are under FEMA individual assistance declarations. So affected homeowners and renters in these counties and areas of South Dakota will be eligible for FEMA. Next slide. So FEMA is operated under, or the individual assistance on FEMA is operated under what they call the Individual and Household Assistance Program. You will hear that as IHP sometimes, and that's what it means. This is the assistance that's eligible for homeowners and renters. There's 3 classifications of assistance that people may be eligible for. Temporary housing, housing assistance, which is home repair, and then something called other needs assistance. Next slide. Temporary housing, this is something that almost everyone, homeowner and renter, who cannot live in their residence immediately after the disaster is going to be eligible for. This is money for you to find supplemental housing during the period of time that your house is not livable, your house or apartment is not livable. The payments are based on the area's median rental cost, so you can get a very different amount in, say, rural South Dakota than you may in, Rapid City, or that you would like if you were affected by the wildfires in California. So this varies depending on the specific area. You will receive each month the state's or that area's median rental cost. So if the median rental cost in that area is $500, you'll receive $500 each month. They find your eligibility in 2-month increments. So most people who are eligible for this at the very beginning will receive 2 months of rental assistance. Then you can receive rental assistance up to 18 months, but they will recertify you in 2-month increments. And you will have to show each time that you have a continuing need for temporary housing assistance. FEMA has gone towards, it used to be temporary housing could be provided by FEMA trailers, and those have, as we know, have had substantial issues, and they're not the best use or the best place for people to live. In Iowa in 2008, they did bring FEMA trailers to Iowa. They were not winter ready, and so our clients had a lot of issues with freezing pipes. They were expensive to heat, and often the doors would freeze shut. And so FEMA has gone more to providing cash assistance rather than actual mobile homes. Next slide. Oh yeah, so it basically is that you have to continue to show that you have a need for assistance. FEMA's going to expect you to get back into your house as soon as you can. Next slide. Housing assistance is the assistance that FEMA will give you to repair your home. And it includes both labor and the cost of materials. The most important thing to remember about FEMA, and they say this a lot, but it's important to remember because this is what causes the hardship for a lot of disaster-affected people. FEMA says we are not an insurance policy. We are not designed to make you whole. Our goal is to make your house safe, sanitary, and functional, not to restore your house to the condition that it was in before the disaster. This, for people, is the most frustrating because under FEMA, it's very different than the Midwest, and FEMA does not consider basements to be living areas, which in Iowa, I think South Dakota is probably very similar. We use our basements constantly for living areas, and I know for my particular, that's half my house is the basement. And so In the basement, FEMA will only replace mechanicals, water heaters, furnaces, electrical boxes, and any vertical vent system. Ductwork. They will not, if you had bedrooms down there, if you had a bathroom down there, FEMA will not replace any of that because they'll say your house is safe, sanitary, and functional with just the main floor. So this is a huge frustration for a lot of people. And I can tell you my house was flooded in 2008. My flooding was all confined to the basement, and FEMA paid for most of my furnace, most of my water heater, most of my electrical box, but did not pay for any of the bedrooms and bathrooms that I had down there, washer and dryer, any of that stuff. So that is frustrating, and that can make it hard for people to fully recover. Next slide. This is not, because of what I just told you, this is not usually a problem, but FEMA money cannot be used to repair the house to a better condition than it was before the disaster unless it's required by current housing and building codes. In all of the FEMA cases I've ever seen, this has never been an issue. People have enough trouble just getting their house repaired, much less getting it repaired to a better condition. But that is out there. So just to be aware of it. Next slide. The third form of assistance is what's called other needs assistance. And this is assistance that is paid for other necessary and serious needs caused by the disaster. It can be medical or dental expenses, funeral costs, replacement of personal property, and maybe storage of some personal property, and damage to vehicles. This is where renters are generally able to get assistance because they obviously are not going to be eligible for home repair. They will get the temporary housing, but renters can often get personal property replaced through this program. Next slide. And I will have to tell you, this is like good news and disaster that happened in 2018. They passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, and this made major differences in FEMA awards. Before this act, FEMA recipients were limited to a maximum award of approximately $34,900, and all three forms of assistance were included in that calculation. So any money that you received for temporary housing took away from your eligibility for home repair. Any money you received for personal property took away from your home repair. So that was why homeowners generally at that point did not get personal property replacement, because they were already at their cap based on home repair. The change in the law is now says you can receive a maximum award of $34,900 for home repair, and then another $34,900 for other needs assistance. So it's basically doubled the eligibility of people for the amount of FEMA that they can get. So this is huge and really helpful to people, because when your house is damaged by a flood, honestly, $34,900 sounds like a lot, but it is a drop in the bucket for all the work that has to be done on as a general rule. Temporary housing is not included in this $34,900 because it does not have a cap. And that is because in some places like San Francisco, New York City, $34,900 will not pay for 18 months of housing assistance, so it does not have a cap. Next slide. Oh, and next slide. Next slide again. The rules for spending of FEMA money. is the money needs to be used for the purpose that FEMA gave you the money. So if the money is given for temporary housing assistance, you need to show that you use that for temporary housing assistance. If it was for home repair, you need to show that it was for home repair. If it was for other needs, again, you need to show what that need was and that it fits with the purpose FEMA gave you the money. FEMA recipients need to keep each and every receipt for how they spent the money. This is really, really important because FEMA has the ability to audit any accounts for the next 3 years after the disaster. And you have to be able to show how you use the money. And I'm going to tell you, having gone through this, it is a pain in the butt to have to keep that many receipts, but it has to be, especially when you're bouncing from home to home and not living in a stable place, but you have to be able to keep every receipt. What I also tell people is if you're going to the Home Depot or Lowe's to buy things for home repair, keep just the FEMA related stuff on one receipt. If you start throwing in like buying a pop, buying, anything like that, then on every receipt, when you have to add all these up, they're going to have to subtract the pop, and it is so annoying to have somebody hand you like 400 receipts for different things and then having to subtract out pop because pop is not a legitimate use of the FEMA money. So I always tell people, only the FEMA related things that will make your life easier, run that pop through as a second purchase. And as I said, FEMA can audit the awards for up to 3 years after the disaster. Next slide. So here are some issues that can come up when people apply for FEMA. The first is proving that you are eligible for FEMA. In order to be eligible, and we're going to separate renters for right now. We're just going to do homeowners because they're the ones where this issue comes up. You have to prove that you own the property. You have to prove that you use it as your primary residence. And you have to prove that the damage was from the disaster and not from what they call deferred maintenance. So how this plays out is proving you own the property. Where we see problems with this is in 2 areas, and it usually involves probate issues. A lot of times, low-income people do not open probates, and so everyone may agree that grandson and his wife can live in grandma's house, and so they do that, and they move in. They take care of the house, they pay the insurance, they pay the property tax. They do everything that an owner would do, except change title from the grandparent's name to the grandson's name. Then when the disaster happens, the property is still titled in the grandparent's name. They've been dead since the 70s. And we have a problem because it doesn't look like the grandson owns the residence. So that is where a lawyer can be very helpful on showing how they have acted as the owner, done all the owner things. They can, and so clearing up some of that title issue on that issue. But this comes up all the time, all around the country. The other issue that happens a lot in Iowa, I'm assuming you have a similar problem in South Dakota, is a lot of low-income people buy property not through a mortgage with the bank, but what we call a real estate land contract in Iowa. And so they're buying it from a third party, but often, at least in Iowa, the title does not change until the completion of the contract. And so when they own it subject to this contract, it's really the seller's name who's still on the deed. And so it becomes very complicated for FEMA to figure out who owns the property because the seller would not be eligible for FEMA because it's not their primary residence. And then sometimes the buyer's not eligible for assistance because FEMA says you don't own the property. So that becomes a very tricky issue. And I will tell you, in the various disasters that we've had in Iowa, FEMA does not take a standard position on that. A lot of it depends on who the person is reviewing the case. I've seen some contract buyers receive FEMA assistance, and I've seen a lot of contract buyers not receive any. There's not a real clear rule on that, so it does take some advocacy to try to convince FEMA that your client is actually, as kind of the owner, even though it's not in their name. Another issue that comes up a lot is, did the disaster cause the damage, or was it deferred maintenance? This can come up a lot with in low-income communities who maybe weren't able to keep their house up, as repaired as maybe we would like. Maybe the siding was kind of in bad shape beforehand, and then a tornado comes through, and FEMA's like, well, that siding was bad before the disaster, so the disaster really didn't do anything. So this kind of becomes a fight also sometimes. I will give you an example just from my house. What happened there was, I live in an old house. It's built in the 1940s. When my house flooded, my porch became detached from my house, and it was kind of hanging there at a weird, very unstable angle. And FEMA took the position that that was not disaster damage because my porch was built in the 40s. It was not up to current code, and that the footers for the porch were just laid out on the soil and not with cement like they require now. So FEMA said because I didn't bring it up to code before the disaster, it was deferred maintenance and not eligible for FEMA repair. So we do see a lot of that issue can spring up, especially with people in older houses. And then the other issue, and an issue that comes up always is, did they use the money properly? Was it used solely for the purpose it was given? A big issue that can become the bane of your existence sometimes in disaster recovery is duplication of benefits. What this means is FEMA will not give you assistance for something that you received money from another source. So what happens is FEMA jumps in generally very quickly and gives people their awards very quickly so that they can get moving on the recovery process. What will happen later sometimes is insurance may kick in and come up and offer a settlement. Then there will be an issue with FEMA on whether is the insurance money a duplication of benefits, and in that case you have to return the money to FEMA. And as you can imagine, this is never as straightforward as it just sounds right now, and so that can become a huge issue later, especially if the state starts kicking in additional disaster recovery programs. This can become an issue for quite some time. So just keep that in mind. Duplication of benefits is kind of a huge issue. Next slide. So we went through all the different ways of what people have to prove to be eligible for FEMA, all the different kind of problems that can occur. And now I'm going to go through how people can file appeals, and this is where lawyers can be really helpful. But I wanted to just say one thing that I didn't have in the slide is an issue that we're starting to see in Western Iowa. And this is a rule from FEMA that if you have received FEMA assistance in the past and you live in what's called a special hazard area, which is basically the 100-year floodplain, if you do not have flood insurance, you are not eligible for FEMA. So what we are seeing is people in 2011, and sometimes as far back as 1993 and then 2008, that people received some FEMA assistance. It may have just been very small amounts. We're seeing people that maybe had water heater and furnace, so maybe they received like $5,000, maybe even $1,500. It's if you received $1 of FEMA, you then, if you live in a 100-year floodplain, are required to maintain flood insurance. Flood insurance in the 100-year floodplain can be prohibitively expensive for low-income people. So many of the people we're seeing now were not able to maintain it. Now their house has been destroyed in 2019. They apply for FEMA, and FEMA's like, you are not eligible because you were required to have flood insurance, and you didn't. And I will tell you, I was at a conference, and I sat with somebody kind of high up in FEMA, and that is a no-go on negotiations on that. They stand strong on that, and there's really nothing as an attorney you can do to argue around that. The only arguments that we have is if you are a subsequent purchaser, you can argue that you didn't know. And so that may be some, but most of the people that are having the problems, they did. They're like, I received $700 for my water heater in 2011, and I couldn't afford the flood insurance. Now my house is destroyed and there's nothing. So I just wanted to throw that out as an issue that you may see in South Dakota too. So if somebody gets a FEMA decision, they're going to get it in writing. I will tell you these decisions are usually like 1 or 2 lines, and you can't tell why FEMA did what they did. They're not, it'll say something, it'll give a number code and then say ineligible, not primary residence, or ineligible deferred maintenance and nothing else. So I always tell people, appeal the decision. And it has to be in writing. You have 60 days from the date of the notice of the decision, but there is a provision if you can show good cause, they will consider late filed appeals. Because FEMA is a huge bureaucracy, I use all their methods of submitting the appeal. So I fax, certified mail, and submit online. It's probably overdone, but FEMA is a big bureaucracy, and I like to show you got it 3 different ways, so you have it, even if you can't find it. Send it to the next page. I'm sorry, next slide. And so these next few slides just contain information on the address you can send it to, the fax number. All of that will be on the notice that your client received. Next slide. What to include in the appeal? I like to include as much information as I can. A written explanation of why the applicant does not agree with the decision. Any new information that your client has, pictures of the damage, if they've had people out to give them repair estimates, if the contractor can give them an idea of how long it's going to take for the repairs to be done, because that will go to that temporary housing assistance. And if they've already started to make repairs, some receipts to show how they've already spent the money and what still is left to be done. So any information that you can have is really, really helpful. If you help with the appeal, it needs to be signed by the attorney, and the applicant's signature needs to be notarized. Next slide. And then the next couple of slides just talk about what FEMA specifically requests in the appeal letter. Person's full name, their current address of the damaged property, their date of birth. For whatever reason, they want their place of birth, last 4 digits of social security number, the disaster number, and their FEMA application number. And FEMA requests or requires that you put this on every single page that you submit. So that's just some information to remember when you submit it. Next slide. This issue is something that will come later in the disaster, but I just wanted to make you aware of it now. Is, as we talked about, FEMA can audit cases for the next 3 years. And they are going to be looking for two things: fraud and overpayment. Fraud is handled very differently, so we're not really going to talk about that. Fraud's going to be through the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then the federal public defender and stuff will get involved with that. So fraud cases don't normally come to us unless we're doing public defender work. But FEMA recoupment, this is the overpayment provision, and this is what, for me, caused probably the clients to have the most tears, even more than when the disaster was occurring, because this happens generally 3 years out from the disaster. You are on your road to recovery, you're maybe recovered, you're at your new normal, and you think life is going well, and then you get a letter in the mail from FEMA that upsets everything. So what happens in these cases is FEMA determines that the applicant was overpaid benefits. Not that there was any fault on the part of the applicant, but that FEMA is now looking at the case, says we shouldn't have paid you what we did. This can happen, one, if the applicant receives an insurance settlement after their FEMA award, the duplication of benefit issue. It can also happen because FEMA has now changed their policies, and they're like, yeah, back in South Dakota in 2019, we were paying that, but now we're under new head, new kind of philosophy, and we're no longer going to interpret the rule that way. So then we're going to tell people, you know what, we no longer think you should have got those benefits that you got because we're no longer paying for X. And so you get a letter in the mail that says you need to repay us back. So this is really upsetting for people on the next slide, because the letter will say, you'll get what's called, and it says right in big letters, notice of debt, and it says that you were overpaid benefits and you need to repay the benefits within the next 60 days. Then it has a provision of how you can appeal, and then it has a provision that lays out all the ways the federal government can take the money from you. So it is really a scary letter. And so people come in with it and they are like freaked out, because I'll give you an example of one of my clients who got the letter. He received $20,000 in FEMA assistance. He got a letter 3 years later that said, we now believe that you were overpaid that. We'd like you to return the $20,000 to us within the next 60 days or enter into a payment plan with us. By the way, you can appeal, but if you lose, here's a million different ways we're going to take the money, including levy on your house. So it was very, very scary. What their position was that he had received insurance later, and so then he should no longer have received the FEMA amount that he received. So what our argument was for him was, yes, he received $20,000 in FEMA, and I think he may have received, let's say, $15,000 from his insurance company. So but it cost him $70,000 to repair his house. So our argument was it was not a duplication of benefits, because all of those were legitimate repairs that needed to be made, and it was only that in that, you know, FEMA had a limitation and his insurance had a cap, and so there was not a duplication because he used those for separate disaster repairs. On that case, we were successful because we were able to pull out all of his receipts, all of his contractor work, all the money he used from him, of his own money. So he had all the information there, and we were able to successfully make that argument. We also had other cases where we were not able to successfully make that argument. What comes up as some other problems with this is often FEMA only has your temporary address and the address that was damaged. So if your house was, not repairable or you were a renter, you probably are no longer at either one of those addresses. So you don't receive the letter, and then bad things can start happening even though you don't have notice of it. So I do kind of remind people to kind of keep a good address of some kind in their FEMA file, even if it's like maybe their mom and dad, just somewhere that a letter will come that they'll be able to find out about. Next slide. And, if you disagree, it's the same way as with the appeal, the same procedure, the same 60 days, the same place you fax, send, and submit online. And so I have all of that information on here too. Next slide. And again, what to include in there is why it's not a duplication of benefits, why it's not, you weren't overpaid that, why you were entitled to that, and that you used it for disaster-related expenses, and you used it the way it was supposed to be, and the hardship it would cause you if they collected this money back from you. Next slide. And then the same thing of all the information about the applicant that they need to have. Next slide. And then what happens post-appeal, because sometimes you are unsuccessful on these. In fact, quite often you are unsuccessful on these, because sometimes it really wasn't overpayment. Often people are in no position to repay FEMA the money they got. You can request in writing that FEMA not collect from them. This is kind of similar to like an offer and compromise and a non-collectible status with tax. In tax cases, you basically show that what your monthly income and expenses are, the hardship it would cause you to have to repay this amount, and FEMA can either forgive all of it, can forgive some of it, or can forgive none of it, and they can set you up also on a payment plan, hopefully that's affordable for you. So I always tell people it's not all is lost. We can come in here and argue hardship and, ask for a little compassion from FEMA, and people have had very good luck with this too. Next slide. Oh, next slide. So that is kind of FEMA in a nutshell. I'm going to do probably about 10 minutes of some of the other legal issues and then leave time for questions for people that have them. So if you can go back to the prior slide. So some of the legal issues, I'm going to lay out what they are. I'll give you some examples of them. And if they're not state specific, I will talk about some arguments or some things that can be done. So the legal issues that come up, like we talked about, are the real estate title issues, because often you have to prove you own the property to be eligible for disaster assistance of any kind, either from federal, state, or a lot of times from the nonprofits that will come and the donated money that comes after a disaster. Tenants have a lot of questions after a disaster. There are issues with mortgages. There are tons of contractor issues. There's issues with door-to-door sales, issues with mechanics liens. Next page. Issues with insurance. There can be educational issues for the children, and then there's a lot of issues of replacing lost documents. So I'm going to go through landlord-tenant, replacing lost documents, door-to-door sales. Most of those are pretty state-specific, so I just wanted to mention that those are issues. But I'm not knowledgeable on South Dakota law, so I'm not able to tell you the specifics. But regarding landlord-tenant, there will be questions about how do we terminate the lease? Can we terminate the lease? Do we get back the rent we just paid and our deposit? And who is responsible for repairs? And Iowa has a pretty protective landlord-tenant law, so tenants have a lot of rights under that, which is really nice. I don't know about South Dakota, so I'm not going to be able to answer very much about that. But that is a huge issue immediately after a disaster is landlord-tenant issues. So moving on to the real estate title issues, this is we talked about, there's issues if your name's not on the deed, so some probate and real estate purchase contracts. Next slide. There can be issues that arise with mortgages because obviously the homeowner is obligated to make mortgage payments until, the mortgage is paid off. But it can be very difficult for homeowners to make their mortgage payment on a house that they're not able to live in if they're paying to live somewhere else. So now they have basically two house payments, and they also have the cost of repairs. So people can get very financially overwhelmed very quickly after a disaster. Some of the mortgage companies are better than others on working with people. One thing to watch out for is we saw a lot of times where the mortgage company would say, yes, we can totally help you because you've been affected by a disaster. You don't have to pay the payments for the next 4 months. And people are like, yay, that is awesome. There's two ways that mortgage companies have handled that. One is they will then tack the 4 months at the end of the mortgage. Other ones have just, delayed the payment, and then so you get 4 months of not having to make your payment. But if you read the paperwork, on month 5 you have to come up and clear the amount you're behind, and people are not able to do that. So it's very important for homeowners to look at what the agreement actually is. So we do see a huge spike in foreclosures during and after the disaster. Another issue that comes up with mortgages is if there is insurance, the proceeds check are generally made out to both the homeowner and the mortgage company. And if you look, sometimes the mortgage company has a lot of control on determining if that money is used to either pay off the mortgage or to be able to make repairs on the house. And a lot of it depends on whether it's economically feasible for the homeowner to be able to repair the house. And I will tell you, the mortgage company takes a very financial black and white view of that, and the homeowner takes a very emotional, this is our family home view of that. And so there can be conflict on that issue. But the nice thing, at least, is that both of them have to be in agreement before that check can be cashed. But I will tell you, I've had to do several declaratory judgments where we've gone into district court and said they don't agree what to do with this check. Judge, can you declare how the proceeds will go? I've never had any of those actually go to trial. Usually when you do that, I've had the mortgage company cave, and they're like, fine, we can use the money for repairs. So, but that is an issue that can come up. Next slide. And then next slide. And next slide. Contractor issues are a huge issue, and these will come for years and years after the disaster. What happens is homeowners are often so desperate to hire a contractor that they don't take as much care as they normally would in hiring a contractor. And I will tell you from personal experience that is completely true, because all you can think in that moment is, I want to get back in my house as soon as I can. And if this guy says he can do it faster than guy X, I'm going to go with the faster guy. And so that happens. The other thing is there's not always enough contractors. And so you really want to make sure the contractor will come to your house first. So you make some bad decisions about maybe giving them more money up front than you normally would. The other issue is huge, is after a disaster, contractor scams and the scammers just hit the area hard. And so contractors just flood the area. Some are legitimate, some are not. And so we recently had a smaller disaster a year ago in a small town that had a tornado, and it was a fairly severe tornado and lots of damage. Within 24 hours of that tornado, contractors were driving and walking and canvassing the neighborhood that was hit. And so we had several people sign contracts that they then regretted. So then some of your state door-to-door sales protections can come into place. Because people are just overwhelmed, and someone walks up to them and says they can fix the problem, and sometimes they will agree to that right away. Next slide. And so what we look at, because some of the necessary precautions are not always in these contracts, because they're often done in someone's yard after the disaster. So we look at, is the contract in writing? Is the scope of the work clearly laid out? Is the payment schedule clearly laid out? Because you will be surprised how often none of that is there. Next slide. Does the contractor have the appropriate license for the work? Do they pull the right permits? Are they paying subcontractors? And does the final work product pass city inspection? All of these come up as issues, and these are with contractors who actually do the work. If you go to the next slide, a big issue in contractors also, and this is the most common, is where homeowners have made payments, sometimes full payments. The contractor never returns to start the work, or the work is only partially completed, and the contractor is completely AWOL. So this we see a ton of. I have, from that small town, we have some pretty bad ones where people have paid like $34,000 and have had no work done, and the guy is gone. He's totally in the wind. So it's very, very sad. Some of the remedies you have are basically in contract law. You can sue for breach of contract, for the return of the payment. The problem is it often involves finding an expert witness to testify to the value of the work that was done, to subtract out, and the value of the work that still needs to be completed. And sometimes these guys are in the wind, and they're going to be very hard to find. Next page. And then an issue is if the work is not completed satisfactorily. And we have one of these where our client had Cadillac insurance. And so the settlement from the insurance company was $129,000. And the insurance company laid out for every room exactly what needed to be done, what needed to be replaced, exactly the brand that the contractor you needed to use to replace it. And so the issue we have on this one is the contractor used always the cheaper alternative, not the one that the insurance company laid out. Like they may have required Pella windows, and the contractor used, I don't know, Joe's Window Company or something, so not what he was being paid for. And so we have a pending lawsuit on one of those. So all of this stuff comes out. Contractor issues have been the bane of my existence for many years. And the next screen. There's often insurance issues. in a flood, they either have flood insurance or they don't. And most of the time they don't. And then there's no flood insurance. And then there's no insurance coverage at all. But if it is a case where there is insurance, it's looking at, is the type of disaster covered by the insurance? What is the deductible? You review the policy with them. And often people don't know what they paid for. And so it's going over with them policy coverage, policy limits, if they have replacement or cash value insurance, what the deductible is, all of those things, because that factors into what the settlement will be. Next screen. And then next screen. And next screen, sorry. And then there can be educational issues if people have where their kids are going to go to school. People that are displaced by the disaster or doubling up or in a new location because of the disaster, their children are going to fall under the McKinneyVento Act. And this will allow their children to go back to their original school, and then the school district has to pay for transportation. If the children want to go to a new school and they don't have all of their paperwork because of the disaster, the school is required to immediately enroll them and then chase the paperwork later. This is really helpful for people because a lot of times that's the only stability their kids are going to have is staying in the same school with their teachers and, their friends. So people really want this to happen. And so telling them you have the right to make this happen can really take some stress off of people and really help children to recover. Next slide. This might be my last slide. Yeah. And then the other issue, and I didn't put this one on because this is so state specific, is replacing any documents that were lost. And we've put out a kit in Iowa for how you can replace those documents and the cost, but South Dakota will have different rules. So I know I have talked for a very long time, so I'm sorry about that. But if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Again, this is Beth Overmo with the State Bar of South Dakota. If you do have a question, feel free to type it into the attendee control panel in the questions tab, and then we will relay those over to Lisa. In the meantime, just to let you know that the Disaster Legal Services Hotline being administered by the State Bar of South Dakota and the Young Lawyers Section, the phone number for that is 1-877-827-6955. Once again, that number is 1-877-827-6955. One question for you, Lisa. I know that there's quite a bit of resource out there as far as websites to turn to for assistance if you're an attorney and you're helping someone during a disaster or following a disaster. Do you have any go-to resources that you use?
I do. The National Legal Services. So if you look up legal services, I can send you the exact link, but it's put out by National Legal Services Corporation, and they have a disaster website, and they have very state-specific information. They also have general information as being an attorney helping someone navigate the disaster response. I will send you that website, and maybe you can push it out.
Yep, we can definitely do that. And then the other question that I have for you, we don't have any other questions coming in, but the other question that I have is, do you work with other non-legal entities after a disaster declaration? And if so, who and how?
I work with a lot, and these are relationships that we built pre-disaster, which is very helpful. But we work with the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the emergency managers at both state and county level. In Iowa, our CAP agencies administer our state disaster grant and disaster case management, and we work with them. We work with them a lot because that's where most of our referrals come. We also work with a lot of faith-based responders that are out in the field.
And one final question from me is, I'm guessing, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but I'm assuming that you work with attorneys who are handling appeals for FEMA on a first-time basis, and they're volunteering. Do you have any advice for them for taking on their first FEMA appeals case or working with disaster survivors for the first time?
Yes. When I came into disaster, I was a Violence Against Women Act. I did domestic violence, family law work, and for 13 years. And then a disaster happened in the city I lived in. And the very next day, I became a disaster response attorney. And I had no knowledge, and I was terrified. There are a lot of people out there who are able to guide you and mentor you through this process. I'm always willing to answer questions for people, and there's a lot of other people like me, so there's a big resource to tap into. It's not to be afraid. I mean, these legal problems are happening in a disaster, but they're kind of the same legal issues. I mean, contractor issues are, contract cases. Dealing with FEMA is like dealing with a lot of agency law. It's very similar to that. So I think that's the thing, is be open to jumping in, because no matter what you are helping, it gives the person so much stress relief to know that someone else is on their side. The other thing is, just from kind of a practical standpoint, and I was probably the same way. Every disaster survivor has the need to tell you their story. They want to tell you what happened. And just to be open and know that that has to happen in the relationship. They need you to know what happened to them, and that they were doing really fine before, and this thing happened that set them off their course. And so they need you to know that. And so be patient with that story, and and it is helpful to know all of that. And, just to know there's all kinds of people out there that can help you, so not to be afraid to take these cases.
Great. Well, we don't have any other questions that are coming in to the attendee dashboard. With that, Lisa, thank you so much for giving us your time and expertise today in discussing FEMA appeals and disaster-related legal issues. Just a couple of housekeeping items is we do have 2 handouts that are available that Lisa provided, both the PowerPoint as well as almost a guidebook that is referencing Iowa law pretty frequently, but it also gives a lot of good information on how to handle certain types of disaster-related legal issues. And then I just wanted to give President of the Young Lawyers section, Nathan Shequin, an opportunity to close out this webinar. Nathan, are you there?
Yes, Beth. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially Lisa. And remember that the Young Lawyers section is here to help with these disaster legal services, requests for legal assistance, and anything that you might encounter.
All right, great. Well, with that, we will close out the webinar. Thanks, Lisa and Nathan.
You're very welcome.
Have a good day.
Thank you.